Well, as I came in, I had told the number of the men that I was going to talk about submission tonight. And you may have noticed that the meeting started just, there it goes, meeting started just a little bit slow because the person turning on the light said, wait, my wife's not here yet. Now that's only partially a joke. It gets pretty serious pretty quickly. And one thing I want to talk about is submission. We oftentimes turn over to Ephesians chapter 5. That's where I would ask you to turn this evening. We're taking a look at Ephesians chapter 5, including verse 22, in which it does say wives are to submit to their husbands as to the Lord. The purpose of my lesson tonight, though, is to place that into a broader context in which we realize that submission is the mission of every Christian. And that injunction to women is one that certainly is gender specific to the wives, and we should be attentive to that. If for another reason it's very countercultural and oftentimes controversial. However, it is within a context when we realize that is something that every Christian should do in modeling themselves after Christ. That's what I want to talk to you about tonight, is the fact that submission is our mission. I want to look at Ephesians chapter 5, really verses 21 down through 33, and look at how these verses should change our lives. We understand that submission is a mission that applies to us individually, me, and collectively, you, as the University Church and other churches and other groups of God's people. And that's my focus here this night, and I hope that it might be transformative in your life as it is in mine as we realize this. You may not know this, but this is for me a homecoming. I was a member of the University Church back in 1995-96, and y'all transformed my life. And I'm telling you this story about submission because you taught me about submission, and I want to share that with you a little bit. When I came here in 95-96, I was in my mid-20s, and though I was strong in many ways, I went home oftentimes in the evening and cried my eyes out. Because like many students who I encounter as a professor and dean, I was inwardly empty. I was incomplete. I lacked real direction in my life. I'd been to school for 4 years and found myself, much to my chagrin, working minimum wage jobs, manual jobs, wondering, what am I going to do with my life? And I intended to be a preacher, but I was going to school in Bible classes and was focused, though, really on the career of preaching. What can I make of myself? And that caused me to be about the consumption of knowledge and not about the giving of it, not about the ways that I could serve others. And though I was not a particularly sinful person in my dating life, I had been not as serious as I should have and had not thought about dating as something that was really for godly purposes and came here in many ways empty in that regard. And came to this congregation, in many ways the people here transformed me. More on that later. How about you? How about this congregation? As you think about your life and the collective life of this congregation, are you on mission? Individually and collectively. Maybe like many people, when you look inside, you realize, you know what? I've really lost my way. Maybe you're not a Christian, and you realize that. Maybe you are a Christian. You say, if I'm honest with myself, I'm really quite empty. I'm off the rails. If you were to ask me what my purpose is, if I'm honest, I'm just not sure. We know what we should say, but it's really not in our heart. Where are you at on that? Do you feel that tension? Many people do in life for a variety of reasons. I've seen individuals lose their job and they've lost their mission. Individuals that have challenges in their lives and something happens to them, a rebellion in their family, a loss in their family, and their purpose goes out the door. I'll confess something to you. Many of you can relate to this with school coming up. My wife and I see our oldest daughter going to college this weekend. Many of you can relate to how that turns your world upside down. Our mission has been about keeping our kids safe in the home, knowing where they are, getting them to this point, and now that it's come, I have to say, I'm wondering about my purpose. What am I doing? Maybe you can relate. That happens in families. There was a survey recently that was much trumpeted in the national media and around the world. It was an international survey of 25 countries. And they surveyed individuals from 18 to 35 around the world, hundreds of thousands of people, and they asked them a series of attitudinal questions about their lives. And it was one of the main findings of the survey was that over a quarter of those around the world, hundreds of thousands of people asked about their life, reported that they often felt lonely and sad. Right? And so for broad swaths of our population, when it comes to their mission, their purpose, their sense of completion, people would say, I just don't have it. I feel empty. I feel incomplete. I feel directionless. I am not on mission. How about you? Well, you know, the early Christians knew what this was like. To know what their mission should be, what their purpose should be, where they should be and who they should be, and yet not to fully be that. In this book, Ephesians, I've had you turn to, we see the early Christians with this problem of having been Christians. They knew the purity that was in Christ. They knew the purpose of living as a Christian. And yet it's very clear that as Paul goes through this book of Ephesians, this was a people who either were in danger of or already realized the reality of getting off track. Paul's many encouragements to them clearly address a situation in which they're in danger of losing their purpose, their mission. And so just look at a few examples here. So you look at the saints in Ephesus, who this book is written to. What you find here is that though they had forgiveness of sins, chapter 1, verse 7, and they knew Jesus, they were Christians, that's very clear, they clearly suffered from lapses of faithfulness. There were problems in their life. And Paul's encouragement, I think, speaks into a real situation in their life where they had a loss of direction. And so you see Paul here in Ephesians talking about how though they were Christians, though they knew who Jesus was, they needed to not lose heart. I don't think he's speaking into a hypothetical situation there. He sees that reality in their life, that they not lose heart, he says in chapter 3, verse 13. He wants them to be strengthened. He knows that Christ is in them, but he wants Christ to be in them more fully. He wants them to be strengthened, and they need to mature. They need to grow and to know what it is to be filled more and more with Christ. As you look through these passages, you realize these are not just what-ifs. He's saying these are things which you need. And he's directing a people whom need to find their mission. And so you go down and you see, for example, in chapter 4, verse 14, the idea that they need to avoid being directionless, knowing where they're going. Finally, he comes down in chapter 4, verse 17. He says, look, I don't want you to walk purposelessly or uselessly. This language, as you'll notice in my ESV, it says in chapter 4, verse 17, he says, I say and testify in the Lord that you must no longer walk as the Gentiles do. Notice that. Christians, stop walking as if you weren't a Christian. And he says specifically, he says, don't do it because they walk in the futility of their minds. Now this language of futility, we get a little bit of in the English, but in the Greek, literally that means without result or without purpose, without mission. He says those people, those Christians out, those non-Christians out there are walking as if they don't have any purpose, any direction, any mission in their life. And he says, don't keep walking like that. And so you see that my situation when I came here to Temple Terrace in 1996, maybe some of your conditions now, is one that the early Christians in the New Testament experienced. And Paul the Apostle directly speaks to that reality. And so we can learn from the New Testament because Paul's going to tell them what they need to do. And what he's going to tell them is that they need to get back on mission. Now, he doesn't use the word mission. In the Greek, it's there. But the word that's translated this, for mission or path or direction, is in English, walk. And if you were to read through the book of Ephesians, you'd find that this is a repeated phrase. And Paul's emphasizing the walk of these Christians. He's trying to pull them back or emphasize where they should be. And so you see then that he emphasizes a number of things about the walk that they should have. Notice here, he says that this was a mission that was one that God had purpose for them. There were good works that God had providentially provided. So if you read in Ephesians chapter 2, verse 10, he says that there are these good works which God has prepared beforehand so that you should walk in them. That's providence. There are things that you should be seeking that God has laid out there for you. He says in Ephesians chapter 4, verse 1, he says, you have a calling. You need to walk worthy of that calling. Is this language resonating with you? That's an emphasis in the book of Ephesians. He says it's a purposeful mission. In other words, stop being like the Gentiles and walk as Christ walked. So it's a mission that Jesus had. We'll come back to that, hold that idea. So you see, Paul is speaking to us. I had lost my purpose and my mission. And he's saying, Christians, there's something out there you should be pursuing. He says, look, this is not something you're on together. Sometimes we think of a lone ranger out there. I'm going to go and pursue my mission in a cowboy western sort of way. No, he says you should walk as children of light, plural, together. You see it? So it's something you're on together. And so forth. He says it's a shared, and he says you should be careful how you walk. And I think the idea there, when he talks about being careful and being carefully how you walk, not as unwise and wise, is that this is a mission which may not immediately occur to you, and you actually may need a lesson on it. It's something that you might need to be reminded of and be careful about, as you would in a precarious situation, watching how you walk. So the main point of what he says here, and I'm just going to show you the lesson, because this is what Paul does. He gets down to the point of saying, look, you need to watch your walk, and he gets down to chapter 5, verse 21. He comes to a conclusion, and he addresses everyone, all the Christians. And we're going to come back to the context here, but he'll go first to the wife, and that's the one we emphasize. But it's just the first in the list. Because he's going to go and talk about husbands, how they need to give of themselves. And husbands are included in those who need to submit to one another, back in verse 21. And he's going to make the point here is that this is akin, this points to, this refers to the wife and the husband relationship to the church and to Christ and vice versa. And so you see, the church should submit to Christ, the wife should submit to the husband, Christians should submit to one another, including husbands' submission to wives. And Paul gets down, he says, look, the walk you need to have is one of submission. Your mission, Christians, is submission. And so what I want to do in the remainder of my time this night is just to unpack a little bit what that means and how that's relevant, and to change us so that we fully understand the implications of this mission that he gives to all of us as Christians. So he says, our purpose, our goals is submission. And he uses this Greek word, hupotasso, which I'll just in a geeky way refer to and say, what that literally means is to purposefully set ourselves, arrange ourselves under something or someone. And so you see the definition of it there. It's oftentimes referred to as submission or subjection and metaphorically obedience. And so you'll see the word sometimes translated that way. But the idea is this is not something accidental. This is not something you stumble into. You're not born into this kind of submission. This is a matter of the will, of the intent, the purpose, the heart. And so he's saying that's what you need to do. And as he goes forward, he'll elaborate on what that means. This is an idea which I think sometimes I struggle to understand. Let me give you an analogy on this. I lived in New York City for 3 years, and every weekday I would work on the Upper West Side of New York City, and I would travel via subway from Morningside Heights to Washington Heights. It was a 20-minute subway ride. Boy, the smells that I experienced over the pace of 3 drove me out. I couldn't stand anymore. But every day, I would get on the subway car, and I would observe which men would submit themselves to women as they got onto the subway car. How did I know that? They would get up and give their seat to the woman. And the idea is they submitted their ability to have a seat and their comfort to the ability and comfort of the women. And so that's what Paul is talking about here, is that you have a situation, you have an authority, you have a right, and you take that, and as it were, in a deck of cards, you put that under someone else's. Say, okay, here's the seat. And you see that in a variety of ways. Jesus experienced that in his life. There's a great passage in Luke chapter 7, verses 1 through 10, when the centurion has a servant, and he wants Jesus to heal them. And we'll just kind of fast forward to observe that the centurion, when he wants Jesus to heal his servant, he says, Lord, you don't need to come to my house. I'm a centurion. I know what it is to report to people, and the word he uses is here, I know what it is to submit myself to rulers, and I have people who report to me and do my commands, and they're in submission to me. And I know, Lord, you have the authority because all sickness and healing is in submission to you, and all you need to do is to say the word. And he knows that healing and sickness is in submission to Jesus. And that's what we're talking about, is that the power to heal was under Jesus. He had authority over that, just as the centurion had authority over his soldiers. That's what we're talking about when we talk about submission. And so Jesus was one who knew what submission was, and he himself submitted himself. We could look at this in length, but you know this idea. The idea is that at Gethsemane, when Jesus prays the Father, not my will, but yours, he's submitting his will to the Father. A passage which I think we should do well, especially our younger people, to remember and the relevance to themselves, is that the Gospels make the point that Jesus, in his early years, submitted himself to his parents. And Ephesians chapter 5 talks about something similar. There's this idea that Jesus, though he was God's son, he put himself under the authority of his parents. And so this was an example which Jesus gives us, and the Scriptures are very clear, lest there be any doubt, that we as Christians should be in submission to God. That's a clear teaching of Scripture. There's no doubt. And so what Ephesians chapter 5, verses 2 through 21, if you turn back there, if you're not already there, what that says is that in our relationships, in our families, biological and in spiritual, our goal, our purpose, our end is submission to one another. Intentionally arranging ourselves under each other, putting ourselves in submission. Christians to other Christians, wives to husbands, husbands giving themselves on behalf of their wives as Christ did the church. And so you see this relationship that tells us who we are to be. Submission is our mission. What about you? So let's bring this home to us. Let me tell you the rest of the story about me first. I'm coming here 22 years old, finding myself dissolving in tears every night because I feel like I'm not on the right track. I can feel that I'm more a consumer of this life than a giver in this life. I know that I'm not a sinful person as we would think of it, but I know that I'm not right. And what I do is I come here in this congregation, and many of you are still here, and there are many who have gone on from this life but elsewhere. And what I do is, as Paul indicates the church should do, I learn submission from the way this church is in submission to Jesus. And that's just how it works. And so what I begin to realize, I'm invited in to teach and to go to classes. I was in many of your houses. You know the impact you had on me. And I begin to realize, you know what, it's not about me. I knew that, but I didn't really know that. I begin to realize this is really about the way that I give of myself to others. Again, I knew that, but I didn't really know that. And I begin to realize, you know what, this young woman whom I've met, that this is not about what I can get out of this relationship. It's about what I can give her. And those relationships changed me because I began to realize my mission is not about consumption, it's about submission. And it's through a slow series of events, including the opportunity I had to go over to Russia where I met Mike Garth and learn what it meant to sacrifice and to serve others overseas, brought this lesson home to me. And I began to see that, you know what, this life is about that. And I've had to relearn that lesson many times, but I learned it in a powerful way here. And what I learned is a lesson which we often talk about. You know this lesson. It's what Paul talks about in Philippians chapter 2 when he says we should in humility count others more significant than ourselves. That's what submission is, higher than me. And so I learned those lessons and recognized that through it as a Christian in my relationship to my wife and her to me, that I should live out this relationship. And I learned this, and here's the major point we're going to come back to in Ephesians 5, which we may not have noticed before. I learned that through the worship and the edification of this church in many ways. How do we learn submission? Question that Paul will answer here in this passage. So again, for you, what does this mean for you? How can we apply this insight that my mission is submission and yours is too? One thing we learn from Ephesians chapter 5 is that this is not something, this submission, this is not something which is done in a solitary way. This is not something that we just go off by ourselves and do. And it's not about certainly having equality among ourselves. That's not what submission is about. Rather, what we learn, as I suggest here, is that submission is about being complementary to others. Now, this is not a compliment and saying a nice thing about another. Notice the spelling. This is about, in other words, matching other people and completing them. Or as we would say here, complementary is the definition. I'll just read it here to you. Combining things in such a way as to enhance or emphasize the qualities of each other or another. Harmonizing, supporting. You know, we talk about complementary colors. That's how we're talking about. These are colors that match well. Or when I was growing up, we talk about meat and potatoes or peas and carrots, right? You think these things complete each other. And what we learn here in Ephesians chapter 5 is that's what submission is meant to do. It's to create a complementary relationship here between those things that are submitting to one another. Harmonizing, supporting one another. And so, as Christians, what we're to do is we're to complement one another. And we know this in a variety of ways. We oftentimes have lessons about how we are a body, members of one another. And it's the joints, it's the connections which cause us to work. But what we don't often observe, even in this passage from earlier in Ephesians chapter 5, verse 15 through 16, is that what makes the body work is not the joints. It's not the connections, it's that we're growing up into the head. It's that we're submitting. That's what makes it work. And that's the key thing we so often overlook. And Paul brings us back to that mission that does cause us to work. And so that's true in the Christian life. We recognize that. And it's also true in the family life. We oftentimes emphasize, for good reason, that the wife is to submit. And there's other passages that talk about that and the reason and the example that is, and how that shows God's purposes and helps us overcome our weaknesses that have existed since creation. And we go back to Genesis and other passages, and we realize that a woman was created for a purpose that was complementary to her husband. And that's the point here, I think, in part, in Ephesians chapter 5. Now, what we also need to observe here is that complementary relationship makes them one, as we can go back in Genesis and you see in Ephesians chapter 5. So our role, and here's the thing to remember, our role is designed by God. We have a role designed by God, each one of us. And that role is to submit to others so that we complete each other. Now, that is an insight which is profound, and if you think about that, it changes your life. Is that I am not on my own, I am not about me, I am about completing others by submitting and serving them, both husband and wife, but also Christian to Christian, and certainly Christ to the church. So Ephesians chapter 5 highlights this, how we should subject ourselves. The other thing that it highlights, which is oftentimes less observed, I just want to take a moment to observe this, is that worship is a way not only of submitting to God, but of submitting to one another. So notice the passage here where we first see this idea that Christians are to submit to one another. Let's read Ephesians chapter 5, verses 18 through 21. Ephesians 5, 18 through 21. Do not get drunk with wine, for that's debauchery, but be filled with the Spirit, addressing one another in psalms and hymns and spiritual songs, singing and making melody to the Lord with your heart. He continues, giving thanks always and for everything, including each other, to God the Father in the name of our Lord Jesus Christ, comma, same sentence, submitting to one another out of reverence for Christ. So often when we read that, we read a hard stop, paragraph, submitting. That's one thought. And so I think what Paul is saying here is that when we sing to one another, encouraging one another in our praises, and when we pray for everything, including one another, I just heard a prayer praying for one another, that is one way we submit to one another. We say, my time, my thought, my energy is not just my own. It's about you. I'm going to sing to you. It's about you. I'm going to pray for you. How many of you know the experience of not submitting ourselves to others in prayer? Right? And Paul's saying, look, out of reverence for Christ, let's submit ourselves, giving thanks for each other, singing to one another, and that's how we show that sort of submission. And so we need to think about our petitions for one another as a form of submission. Let me make a suggestion to you. Your leadership here, the elders and the preachers, put a lot of effort, and others do, the deacons and many of you, into the bulletin that gets formed, that has names and things to pray on or and over. And we oftentimes think about those people, but I want to suggest to you that that bulletin is more than just a prayer list, it's a gift list. The idea is that when we see people that we can pray for, that's a way of giving of ourselves, of submitting ourselves, our time, our energy, our thoughts, our efforts to them. And I think that's what Paul's saying here. Submission is not just doing what other people say, right? It's saying things about other people and giving of yourself. And so I think that's one thing he's emphasizing. Our worship is not just about submission to God. When we sing to others, it's about submission to one another. You see that? So Paul's emphasizing that here. And so here's my question. If we were to do this as a congregation, if we were to say, okay, I'm in. I'm going to stop living a half life. I'm going to stop stumbling around. I'm going to make myself whole. I'm going to start completing others. I'm going to set this goal for myself, and I'm going to try it out. I'm going to see what happens if I start submitting myself to it. What would that mean for us? How would that vision translate into our actions and our lives? What would that look like? Can you think about that with me for a moment? What would that look like? Well, let me suggest 3 ways that having submission as our mission would transform and change our life. So, first of all, we would go back to Matthew 28. Will you just, I'll have it on the screen, but let's flip back to Matthew 28, verses 18 through 20. We oftentimes talk about this passage as the Great Commission. And if we were to center ourselves on submission to one another and how that's important to God and how that should be everyone's mission, what we'd realize is the Great Commission, our commission, that we fulfill and we teach others to fulfill, is about submission. The commission is about submission. And if you reread this, you realize the wisdom of the book that was recently, well, it's been a while now, it was written by a man named Dallas Willard. The book was called The Great Omission, and the title of the book is a play off of the language of the Great Commission. And he says the thing that people often omit from the Great Commission is the fact that this is not primarily about people becoming Christians, although it is about that. He says this is primarily about people becoming disciples who submit their will to the authority of Jesus. And that's not just being baptized, which is oftentimes how we read this. That's about becoming disciples. What does it say there? You notice the Great Commission. He emphasizes there in that context, go therefore and make disciples. People who not only are going to become Christians, who are going to put me on in baptism and walk in allegiance to me, but will be learning of me throughout their life. And not only that, you need to teach them to observe all that I have commanded them. What is that if not submission? You need to teach them to be in submission. And when we realize the importance of submission as our mission, we realize that the Great Commission is not just about initial belief in baptism, but about emphasizing obedience and allegiance to Christ, submission to Jesus. That's what we want to teach people to do. Secondly, if we were to say, okay, my mission is submission, it would cause us to realize what I've said about complementary relationships. It would cause us to realize that collectively. And I think it would cause us to realize that our mission is co-mission. It's not something that we do on our own. If I was a member of this congregation, I would need to, as a Christian, to recognize that you and I can only fulfill our mission if we do it together. We need each other in this. It's true in the husband and wife relationship. We need each other as a congregation. So imagine asking ourselves, who around me can I make whole? Can I make complete by submitting to them, giving myself, my time, my effort, my prayers, my will to them? Let me give you an example of this. Many of you know the congregation, the Embry Hills congregation in Atlanta, Georgia. My wife and I there worshiped for about 10 years. I preached there for a number of years. And we came there in 98, needing to be at that congregation. We were a young couple. We'd been raised as Christians. I think we were pretty strong, but we needed to have the experience of having older Christian men and women take us and teach us. And those men and women, in many ways, submitted to us. Now, they would say at the time, we weren't that old, but they took the time. And they had lots of fears. They would say, you know, I'm going to tell you some things, I'm going to teach you this class, but I feel so inadequate. They would say that. But the point is, they would submit their own fears, their own inadequacies. They'd submit their lack of time, and they gave it to Vivi and me. And I'm forever grateful because they gave of themselves, they submitted themselves, and they did for her and for me what Paul talks about over in his letter to Titus, when he talks about how the older women are to teach the younger women. And one of the things the older women are to teach the younger women is how to be submissive to their husbands. And that is to say that there's a complementary relationship there, a co-work to where the younger women can't fulfill all that they should do if they don't have the older women fulfilling their responsibility, their submission to the younger women. And we experienced that at Embry Hills, and I know that it exists here too. And so whatever your identity and whatever your role, you have to ask, how has God designed me and my role so that I might complement and fulfill the needs of others? And that's what Ephesians 5 teaches us. And you can do that through encouragement, instruction, other investment of time. And I want to encourage you tonight to begin to do that. Think about this. If that's your mission, how can you start to do that if you're not already? And I do believe it begins on a journey of small steps, a decision to write a card or make a call or schedule a lunch. And what you realize is that we're all working together, and there are things that others can't do that I can, and that I can't that they can, and we need to submit to each other in order to fulfill that. Now, you may be thinking, John, I don't think that's right. Well, this is what Paul's talking about over in 1 Corinthians chapter 16. Let's read there how he talks about the Christians. And notice the language of subjecting and fulfilling what others couldn't do. He writes here about the household of Stephanas. Notice what he says here about the household of Stephanas. He says, I urge you, brothers. This is 1 Corinthians 16, verses 15 through 17. He says, I urge you, brothers, you know that the household of Stephanas were the first converts in Achaia, and that they have devoted themselves to the service of the saints. Be subject to such as these, and to every fellow worker and laborer. I hope you see the connections. I rejoice at the coming of Stephanas and Fortunatus and Achaicus, because they have made up for your absence. The idea is that they have done things that you couldn't do. They submitted themselves, they served in ways you couldn't, and you need to do the same for them by submitting them. And not only them, but to every fellow worker, because you're working together. And the way you work together is in submission to one another, putting their needs ahead of your own. It's a beautiful thing. It's a life worth living, to give yourself to others like that. And it's what Christ calls us to. Submission is commission. We share a design to complement and to complete each other. Thanks be to God for that design, who's made us like this. So, finally, you think about what this means. What are we talking about? We're talking about spiritual submission to one another. And I think this is so different than what the world teaches us to do and ingrains in us. I'm just going to lay it out there for you. The world teaches us to be in spiritual, not submission, but competition. Yeah? We see someone who has a strength and we are jealous of it. Or we see a strength that we have and we think, I'm glad I've got that. That's what the world teaches us, and Christ subverts that. He reverses that. He turns that over, and that's not what we should be. Rather, we should be seeking to be in submission to one another, and we should speak to one another in ways that show that submission. Practice this. It's difficult. When someone says, I'm sorry to trouble you about this, you say, no, I'm in submission to you. That'll get their attention. But what you're saying is that I'm counting your needs greater than mine, and whatever you need, I'm there for, in my words, my actions, my will. And when Christians can start to talk to one another like that and live that way, it's transformative. And that's our mission, and that's what we're called to here. Notice how Paul does this. Paul's letters are full of this, but we're so familiar with it, it's sometimes overlook it. Paul is someone who lives in submission to his fellow Christians. And you see it especially in his expressions of thanksgiving. It's clear that in everything, Paul is giving thanks for them, always mentioning God to God, them in his prayers. And the idea is his time, their time is his time is their time. And so we should do what Paul does at the end of his letters, giving time to submitting ourselves to our fellow Christians in gratitude, in praise, and in service. Well, I think you've got the idea here. So when we come together on the Lord's Day, on Wednesday night, what are we doing? Yes, we're doing the work of the church. We're worshiping. We're edifying one another. We're giving to people's needs. But the purpose for all of that is to submit to one another in worship, in edification, in our service to one another. Humbling ourselves to God, yes, but also to each other. And so I want to encourage you as Christians, give your seat to each other. Give it to each other. And in so fulfill the law of Christ and show reverence to Christ. So grateful to Paul for giving us this lesson, for teaching us how we might overcome this world's emptiness. And I hope that you'll pray with me now as we go to God, asking for fulfillment of this mission in our life. Will you pray with me, please? God in heaven, we submit ourselves to you and to your Son, Jesus Christ, and to your Spirit and the Word that they have revealed to us. As I've said, we sometimes feel depleted and directionless and depressed. And we confess that our circumstances, including COVID, has at times only added to our disconnection from you and your people. Forgive us. God, forgive us for our backsliding and our wandering ways. We thank you for your faithfulness and for the obedience and submission of you in Jesus, for his example of submission and the purpose and power that he gives to our lives. Thank you. Thank you that he intentionally lowered himself in order to meet our needs for spiritual purity and example. Thank you for this revelation in Ephesians 5 and for the instructions to wives to submit and for husbands to love and give themselves up for their wives and for the church to submit to your Son and for us to submit to one another. We commit ourselves to making submission our mission, to complementing one another in the church and in the family in order to be united and to overcome our selfishness. God, we will help one another in our worship through encouragement and prayer, giving our time and our attention to each other's needs. God, we will reframe our evangelism towards a life of submission in discipleship, and we'll seek to teach and to complement each other, making up for what each other lacks by our humility and our thanksgiving. Father, especially in this time of pandemic, our protection from selfish and judgmental lives is submission to the needs and the preferences of each other. So God, inoculate us from pride. Vaccinate us with submission. Mask our wills. And may yours be done through our commission in the loving service of Jesus Christ, in his name. And all God's people said, amen. Thank you all.